Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskind Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here, also a proud City Club member. And once upon a time, I was a proud English Lit and Language Arts teacher at a public high school in California. That's one of the big reasons why I'm so pleased to welcome today's speaker, resident scholar and director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and a former high school social studies teacher himself, Dr. Rick Hess. Here in Cleveland and in Ohio, we are intimately familiar with wave after wave of education reform. From No Child Left Behind to Race to the Top and its link to the Common Core, from the Every Student Succeeds Act to Cleveland's own transformation plan, we have seen curricular changes, testing regimes, so-called accountability measures, and what has been called one of the laxest charter school authorization laws in the nation by a speaker on this podium. I'm not making that up. We have also heard from reformers and researchers here at the City Club: Linda Darling Hammond, Diane Ravitch, Michelle Rhee, Mackie Raymond, David Kirk, David Figlio, and so many others. And of course, at perhaps every one of these events, one audience member or another has asked, when will Ohio fully and equitably fund public schools, as the state was ordered to do so so many decades ago in the now famous Supreme Court case to Ralph versus the state of Ohio? So add that to your list of questions to answer, Rick. Enter Rick Hess and his latest book, Letters to a Young Education Reformer. With classroom experience and decades in policy reform, he offers his perspective on the movement and what the next generation of educators and policymakers can learn from reform efforts he has worked in and watched. In addition to his post at the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Hess is also the author of an eponymous blog at EdWeek and the executive editor of Education Next. He has continued to teach, though in higher ed, and he received his own training, his own higher ed training, at a couple of small schools in the Boston area, Brandeis and Harvard. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rick Hess.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for that kind and warm introduction. Hey, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Ed Policy Studies at AEI, as Dan noted. And let me be real straight with you. First off, I am not going to stand up here today and offer any answers in terms of curriculum instruction, scope and sequence. I haven't been in front of a K-12 classroom since the last century. So let's just make sure we keep expectations. And then the second caution I want to give is, look, a room like this, you all have been to many of these talks over the years in which fine people have come through with lots of thought and lots of care and laid out solutions for how we are going to transform the quality of schooling. You know what? In my experience, most of these, despite the thoughtfulness, despite the good intentions, actually have disappointed us. And I just got to admit, I am all out of straightforward solutions. I am not here today to tell you, here is how we are going to transform the quality of schools in northeastern Ohio. Let me just be real straight about that. But I'm not here to share gloom and doom and frustration. I think part of the reason why so many well-intended efforts have disappointed is because of how we've gone about them, the questions we've asked, and therefore the answers we've wound up settling upon. So I'm going to leave telling you what the right way forward is in terms of this policy or that prescription to some of the other folks who are going to visit with you this year. What I want to talk to you today is how we actually drive these changes and how we make them work for kids. Let me put it this way. Those of you who've been doing this long enough may remember when U.S. Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings insisted about 15 years ago that No Child Left Behind did not need to be changed, that it was 99.9% pure, in her words, like ivory soap. You may remember when Secretary of Education Arne Duncan said in 2010 that the Common Core was the greatest thing to happen to public education in America since Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. For my part, I think both NCLB and Common Core actually had a lot of problems, and that a lot of those problems were the way they were executed, and that these big, bold, ambitious efforts have disappointed. Now, when you think about the reforms that have marked the landscape of 21st century schooling, No Child Left Behind, Common Core, Race to the Top, these big capital letter promises are designed to address big social challenges. I call it big R reform. It's capital letter reform. And it's because the challenges themselves are big. So many of the folks in the world of education are focused on school reform because they see it as a way to address huge challenges in American life. Economic inequity, racial tension, how to grow the GDP 50 years downstream. I think part of the challenge is when you start with school reform as the answer to some of the nation's biggest and most intractable dilemmas, you wind up with school reform, which is not always about improving schools, but is about feeling like we're trying to do something good that matters. So let me just be real straight. I come at school reform from a different perspective. I got into school reform, I often say, because I hated second grade. I was bored, I was troublesome, I was getting in fights all the time and losing almost all of them. And so they had the specialists in Belmead, New Jersey, sit down with me, and they couldn't figure out what the learning challenges were, so they just skipped me a grade, because that was how we did things back then. And then I got beat up by bigger third graders. And that was, that was my life in school. And then it was interesting. We'd moved to Northern Virginia to one of the nation's great public school systems, Fairfax County, and I wound up in a school with a phenomenal sixth grade teacher, Selma Ziff. She had a room full of sixth graders thrilled about learning probability because she turned the classroom into a gambling casino where we gambled for M&Ms for 2 weeks. Now, there was nothing about the way she executed that 10,000 other sixth grade teachers couldn't imitate. It turns out, in retrospect, I think, that it's not necessarily the curriculum she used or the instructional materials, but it was how she did it. It was 1,000 small judgments she made every day, because schools, classrooms, are the most human places I know. They're places where great classrooms and great schools are the product of thousands of little decisions made by educators, by children, by parents. And the question is, how do you get people to make those decisions? Now, after sixth grade, most of school was, once again, tedious and boring for me for the majority of my time in 7 to 12. And the funny thing was, when I went on to college and started to meet people from other places, how common that experience was. That so many people, whether they went to suburban schools or urban schools, whether they came from wealthy families or less advantaged families, spent tons of time in school, disengaged, frustrated, and alienated. And the question is why? The question is why, because when you think about how we interact with youth, with our kids, with our grandkids, with our nieces and nephews, when we coach things, right? Teaching is among the most intuitive acts that we know. Kids are hardwired to ask questions, to be curious, right? This is how they drive us crazy as parents. We are hardwired to share things, to share our passions, to help kids grow. So when we have built places that are in nothing but the business of helping kids learn about their world and allowing educators to coach those kids and help them grow, how in the Lord's name did we wind up with places which are so often stale and sterile and disconnected from the things that matter? Well, after college, I decided I wanted to try to tackle some of this. I went off to teach in East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana. This is before there was even something called Teach for America. And I went down there and I wanted to connect with these kids, make a difference, and I failed. And the failure is obviously on me. But I think it was also what struck me at the time was how schools are actually not designed to help teachers do the things that create those great classrooms. I taught high school social studies, and I was teaching 150 kids a day. It turns out, no matter how passionate you are, no matter how much you want to connect with kids, it's actually really hard to connect with 150 kids in a day. I wanted to create dynamic lesson plans, but it turns out that the paperwork burden and the reporting leaves it so that you start to do this stuff 11 o'clock at night. I could do some of that because I was 22 years old with no commitments. But if you're 32 years old and you've got children to raise, it's a different story. And more fundamentally, I found that it was a system where you had lots of people who meant well, and then it treated them as if they were in a Kafkaesque prison. I remember I was supposed to start the third advanced placement economics program in the state of Louisiana. First year we didn't do it because. Second year we were going to do it, but they'd already built my schedule full up, and so there was no room for me to teach it. So I went to my principal, and I said, hey, I'll give back my prep period. I don't need it. You know, I was 22, right? You're stupid when you're 22. And he said, well, Mr. Hess, that's not the way we do things. I said, well, look, I'd be happy to do it. A bunch of kids are up for taking it. I think it'd be fun. He said, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you go downtown and talk to them? And if they say it's okay, we'll do it. So being 22, I got on my pickup. I drove over to downtown. I met with the associate superintendent for curriculum instruction. I explained the situation. I said I was happy to volunteer to teach this class. Would he please notify my principal? Pulled into school the next morning. My principal was standing on the edge of the parking lot saying, Mr. Hess, what have you done now? I said, what do you mean? What do you mean, boss? I said, come with me. So we went and sat in his office, and he said, what'd you do yesterday? I said, I don't think I did anything wrong this time. He said, did you go to Central? I said, I did what you told me to do. I got him, I drove over, I spoke to him, we had a very nice talk, I volunteered to teach it. He said, Mr. Hess, I just got chewed out for 10 minutes this morning for having my teachers running out of muck. He said, didn't you know I was kidding? And I think that is the life that's experienced by so many teachers and principals. People who want to try to solve problems for kids find themselves caught up in the gears of all of this. And it was funny because when I was down there in Louisiana, the reforms that we were talking about did not seem pitched to address any of these challenges that I was experiencing. So I went back, I do what we do when we get frustrated in life, right? I went to grad school. And I went and I did my Ph.D. And what I was trying to do was understand, why do certain reforms get adopted? Why are reforms so removed from what we actually do? So this was my dissertation up at Harvard. I was studying urban reform across 57 districts in this nation. Cleveland was one of them. I got money from the National Science Foundation. I was all excited. And then I had a problem. Couldn't do this study that I had wanted to do. Because at a time when you would read in the headlines all the time about how we needed to shake up urban education, I couldn't study which districts are doing which reforms because every district was doing every reform I was studying. In fact, the average district in the 5 areas I was looking at had launched at least 11 major reforms in the previous 3 years. That's one every 3 months, give or take. That's every 13 weeks. Any of you who have ever lived in an organization where somebody's rolling out a major reform every 13 weeks knows how everybody's going to respond. You close your door and you tell your neighbor, this too shall pass. And the only people who take this stuff seriously after a little while are the newbies and the perpetually naive. But after the third time they've spent their summer preparing lesson plans for something that's forgotten about by Christmas, even they get it. And so what happens is we create these cultures where no matter, and here's what people have trouble with, no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how thoughtful the reforms don't pay off. And it's not because the reforms aren't good ideas. It's because they are pursued and dropped into systems in ways that almost guarantee they're going to disappoint. You're familiar with how physicians worry about overprescription of antibiotics because we worry that we're going to create drug-resistant superflus? I fear what we've managed over the past quarter century is to create reform-resistant schools, where no matter how thoughtful the reform, no matter how careful it's intended to be, it is dropped into a site where teachers are so frustrated, so distrustful, so disinclined to think it's going to be around more than 6 months, that none of that stuff, those 1,000 subtle judgments that get made every day, none of those are actually aligned for these things to work for kids. Now, when it's actually worse than that, because when these things disappoint, what happens is those of us on the outside who are reformers look at schools, we say, you guys aren't even trying to do this. You're not buying in. So we get frustrated and we try to come up with even bigger, bolder big R reforms to make the educators respond. And the educators get even more defensive and even more dug in. And they're even more resistant to this stuff happening. And so what happens is not only does each reform not deliver, but we tell each other as reformers, well, we tried. If that one didn't work, maybe this next one. What we don't understand is that each reform makes it less likely the next one's going to deliver. And on top of that, If you believe, like I think I learned 30 odd years ago in Mrs. Ziff's class, that it's actually those judgments that the teacher make that deliver great schooling, our reforms can actually move us further away from the schools we want because we create places where educators are less and less comfortable exercising those judgments, where they don't feel like they have the freedom to make the decisions that are connect with kids and move them along. So if you accept all of this, what does it mean? Does it mean that reform has been a failure? No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that so many of these big passions and good intentions have been pursued in ways that have hindered them or even undermined them. So what do you do about it? Let me give you 5 lessons that I think I've learned. The book, as Dan mentioned, Letters to a Young Ed Reformer, is about 22 essays trying to tackle a whole bunch of these things. But I'm going to not subject you to that, out of mercy, I guess. But 5 lessons I think that help us think much more clearly about when and how reform and change can work for kids. 1, we need to fundamentally refashion the relationship between talkers and doers. There are talkers and doers in any line of work. If we're talking about policing or sanitation, there are people who actually are walking the streets or out on the trucks, and there are people who offer commentary and analysis, the doers and the talkers. If you're a football fan, there are doers who are actually out on the field and coaching every week, and there are people who are sitting up in the press box talking about how bad the Browns are doing. Doers and talkers. In education, the doers are peoples in schools and systems, and the talkers are those of us at think tanks and advocacy groups and foundations on the outside weighing in. We both have roles to play, though. Here's the funny thing. The doers, they're the ones who actually see how things are playing out when rubber hits road. They're thinking in terms of individual kids. You know this when you talk to educators. They're talking about these children, this class, this curricular unit. It gives them powerful insight into how things are actually working in the real world. But it also gives them big blind spots. When you go to the same school every day for 190 days a year, you don't see what's happening in other places. You just don't have that opportunity. When you show up at work every day with the same set of colleagues, when you hear people criticizing the results, you tend to get defensive. These are you and your friends that they're criticizing. Teachers don't have a lot of time for esoteric white papers and analyses of macro performance because they're worried about planning the next day's lesson. So what happens here is both the talkers and the doers have a critical piece to play. But what's happened in my experience over the last decade or more is that we have forgotten about that healthy synergy. That as we have professionalized school reform, the people who get the privilege of coming up to the Cleveland Club to talk about schooling tend to be people who are authors and think tankers and philanthropists. It's our perspective that predominates. We're the ones who get to go on talk radio and on TV and write op-eds and write books. And so what's happened is that we have tended to create this asymmetrical conversation where it's the talkers that predominate. And we don't even realize this because when you're on TV and radio and writing op-eds and getting money from big foundations, you feel like you know what you're doing. People respect you, they're nice to you, they listen to you. And so you wish those doers would just shut up and get in line. And when our big ideas get dropped on schools and systems and don't pay off, we say, those doers fumbled the ball. We don't even actually own the mistakes of our own reforms. What we do is we say this was an implementation problem. And an implementation problem means those guys on the ground messed it up. Second thing we got to get better at is we've got to understand the limits of policy. We've tried to ask policy to do things policy's not capable of doing. Policy is great at 2 things. It's great at making people do things and making people not do things. So if you want to make sure there's no more than 24 children in a classroom, policy is a great lever. If you want to make sure that teachers have certain credentials, policy is a good lever. But most of what we talk about as school improvement, stuff like teacher evaluation, school turnarounds, aligning curricula, these are things where what matters is much more how you do it rather than whether you do it. And the problem is we've acted as if fighting for the policy win is what really matters. And so we've kept putting policies on the books, which have been dismal disappointments in practice. One of the most telling examples here, I think, is teacher evaluation reform. Those of you who've been doing this for a while may remember that about a decade ago, an outfit called the New Teacher Project did a hugely powerful report called the Widget Effect, pointed out that across the country, and even districts that were doing terribly, 99% of teachers were always rated effective. Nobody thought this was the case. So in the Obama administration's race to the top, in the Obama administration's waivers from NCLB, they encouraged states to get serious about rethinking teacher evaluation, about using test scores as a component of it, using observational rubrics carefully devised. 30-odd states acted. One of the very first out of the box was Colorado with its lauded Senate Bill 191. Last year, Colorado reported that after 7 years of ferocious efforts on this, hundreds of millions spent, tens of millions spent in Colorado, tens of millions of dollars spent, lots of effort, exquisite care, a lot of back and forth between teachers and unions and reformers. They had the results that they'd gone from 99% of teachers rated effective to 99% of teachers rated effective. In fact, Matt Kraft of Brown University did a paper last year that showed nationally the movement was from 99% of teachers rated effective to 98% of teachers rated effective. And he pointed out that the problems were all the stuff that most of us should have been able to predict. Principals didn't want to pick fights with their teachers. They didn't believe ineffective teachers would actually get moved out. The student learning objectives were incompetently executed, blah, blah, blah. The point is that for all of the time and energy and political capital we used to fight for teacher evaluation reform, we created little change, almost no change that actually mattered for kids, and we created huge brushback. It's not whether you do these reforms, it's how you do them. Third thing I've learned is that we've got to be much more careful about how we use expertise. Now, I don't want this to come across as some kind of expertise doesn't work rant. That's not the point. If I'm going to a dentist, I want my dentist to be expert in knowing how to read an x-ray to find a cavity, and I want her to be expert in wielding a drill. If I'm taking one of my boys in for a special needs diagnostic, I want that special educator to be expert in identifying learning challenges and in suggesting interventions. But notice what we're talking about. We're talking about expertise as being very good, knowledgeable, skilled at doing a particular tasks under particular circumstances. When we talk about expertise in education, that obviously applies when you're teaching a third grader phonemic awareness. But a lot of what we talk about expertise for is much broader. Charter schooling, accountability, teacher evaluation. Think about what it means to be an expert in teacher evaluation. In these teacher eval systems, you need psychometrically sound assessments that gauge student learning. That's one skill set. You then need somebody who can actually use those tests to generate value-added metrics for individual teachers. That's another skill set. You need people who know how to utilize the Danielson observational rubric in classrooms. That's another skill set. People who know how to use the Marzano model. People who know how to train people in the Marzano. By the time you actually work through what was in most state teacher eval systems, you get lots of different kinds of expertise. Now what happens is that's not how the world works. So when a legislature or a foundation or a governor needs somebody to be the point person on their teacher evaluation reform effort, they tap one of these experts. You ran an organization, or you were active in reform, or you study this at the university. And what happens is you're an expert in 10% of what's going on, and then you're kind of making up the other 90% and leaning on your friends along the way. When it doesn't work, though, we say, well, the experts were in charge, so it wasn't that, it was that it was an implementation problem. Well, the problem is when we're doing these large-scale reforms, most of what matters is the judgment and the common sense and how the pieces fit. And unfortunately, there actually really is no expertise in most of that. The problem actually gets a little worse than this, though. About a decade ago, I was in South Korea for the State Department, traveling the country, giving talks, groups like this to principals. We did a thing at the South Korea Ministry of Education, where they had the cameras and the reporters, and they're asking me questions as the American expert. And I do what we do when we're in that forum, which is I just started rambling about things I didn't know. And at one point, somebody asked a question, Mr. Hess, you're an expert in American higher education. What lessons can we learn here in South Korea from America? And I didn't know what the heck to say. So I rambled for 30 seconds until I stumbled upon the root of a bit of an idea. And I said, well, in America, we have more than 4,000 institutions of higher learning, and they're scattered across the nation, and they are hubs of energy and talent and small towns. And I said, in South Korea, everything's clustered in Seoul. Maybe that's something to think about. I didn't know what I was talking about. Went back to the hotel. The next morning, my translator's banging on the door. When she greets me, she's holding up the newspaper, page 3, there's my mug, and a bunch of Korean I can't read. And she says, we have to go back to the ministry. I said, what's up? Why? She said, I'll tell you in the car. So we get in the car because I didn't know what I was talking about. I know nothing about South Korean education. I didn't realize 6 months prior, South Korean Ministry of Ed had put out a 10-year strategic plan for South Korean higher education. No mention of diversifying beyond Seoul because it doesn't make any sense. It already lives in Seoul, and that's where the institutions are. So we had to go over, and I had to apologize, and we narrowly avoided an international incident over higher ed strategic policy papers. But the funny thing is, in the back of that car on the way over, I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? It's still a darn good idea. And you've all been there, right? We've all been there. We say things, we get attached to them. So think, when you have been running an organization that champions value-added measurement of teachers for 5 years or 10 years, and somebody finally taps you as the expert, you're not an honest broker of careful information. You're not a good judge bringing common sense to bear. You're an enthusiastic kind of reformer who, by gosh, is going to jump through this chance to make things change. We've got to get much more careful and deliberative about what we think expertise can do for us and when we have to make sure that common sense is in the driver's seat. Fourth, real simple, we have to learn that history matters. Not history matters in the sense of, if we don't know it, we're doomed to repeat it, but in a much more simple sense. Our schools were not built to do what we're asking them to do. First law providing for public provision of education in American schooling. Anybody remember the year? 1647. The old delude or Satan law in Massachusetts Bay Colony. If you remember the Crucible, they had a problem, right? They had this witch problem. They were worried that left untended, kids would become witches. So they needed schools. So any community with at least 100 families had to build a school. And it was widely successful. You hardly ever meet witches in Massachusetts today. But it was designed to meet the challenges and needs of a very different era. Well, today, in fact, 250 years later, in 1900, only 1 American in 10 was finishing high school. Today, it's a totally different world. We want every one of our children educated to a high level in reading and math and STEM and so much more. That's the right goal. But there's no earthly reason to presume that the schools and systems we've inherited are designed to do it. And when they don't do these things we would like them to do, we don't say, hey, maybe we've got to reimagine them. We say they're failing. Well, failing to me presumes that they used to be able to do this and now they don't. They've never done what we're asking them to do. Nobody in the world has ever done what we're asking them to do. So maybe we need to reinvent and reimagine. And to my mind, that's why ideas like charters and vouchers and inline learning are such an important and healthy part of our toolkit as we think about this, because we need to create opportunities for educators and communities and families to figure out different models of how we serve kids best. Fifth and finally, we've allowed school reform to be defined by our passion, and that's a great thing. I mean, it's wonderful that so many people come to school improvement because they want schools to do such important things in the world. I mean, of all the problems in the world to have, too much passion's a really good one. You know, we could be like airline customer service. That's a much bigger problem. But one of the tricks with passion is it can blind us. And when I teach this stuff to educators, here's the example I always use. Old children's story, Stone Soup. Most of y'all will remember it. The version I always tell, 3 soldiers are walking home from Revolutionary War through New England. It's bitter winter, it's cold, they're hungry. They come upon a little town, knock on a door, they say, can you spare any food? The villager says, sorry. Knock on a handful of doors, no luck. The 8th door, final door, 3rd soldier says, let me try something. Knocks on the door, says, hey, can we borrow a big pot? Soldier goes, really? All right, you can borrow a pot, sure. Takes the big pot, build a fire under it, they put it in the middle of town, they fill it with water from a stream, and then that 3rd soldier goes and finds a big, interesting-looking rock and puts it in the pot. One of the villagers comes out and says, hey, what are you guys doing? They say, oh, we're making stone soup. Stone soup? What's that? Oh, it's fabulous. You'll love it if you've never had it. We're happy to share it. The villager goes, well, that's great. We're so sick of having the same couple things over and over. The soldier says, you know, the one thing is stone soup's great. It's even better. with a little bit of carrot. And the butcher goes, oh, I could spare a little carrot. During the commotion, somebody else comes over, asks about what's going on. Oh, onion, potato, rabbit. 4 hours later, they're all sitting down, eating stew out of these heaping bowls, and everybody says, ooh, stone soup is phenomenal. What's the lesson? What does our passion blind us to when we get too excited? That it wasn't the stone, that it was everything else that made it work. Well, this, for my money, is the parable of school reform. When you think about these reforms that always seem to work somewhere, what happens at the places where they worked? These are the pilot sites where somebody goes in and finds a school district or a principal who is enthusiastic about doing it. It's a school where the teachers sign on. That's why they're starting it out here. They get a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, from the local collective bargaining agreement so that they can do extended days and additional training. They get support from the foundation that's underwriting this idea because this is their test site. They get hands-on, loving care from the big shot professors and creators who came up with the idea. And then, turns out that the stew is delicious. And people go, aha, we finally have found the stone that will transform schools. And then they take the idea and they carry it to the next school or the next district and they try to implement it and it doesn't work. And they don't say, hey, we were so hoping to have found the answer that we were blind to what was really going on. They say, instead, we've got an implementation problem. The doers didn't do it right. And the educators feel frustrated, and the reformers get annoyed, and we move on to the next promising solution and start this thing all over again. The trick here is that so often, if you believe that what characterizes great schools and great classrooms is judgment and trust and empowering educators and then holding them responsible for serving kids well, that so many of our well-meaning efforts to carry promising ideas from one place to the next actually get in the way of that. So look, let me close with this. Like I said, I think I'm less confident about what the answer is than I was 30 years ago when I started doing this substitute teaching for pizza and beer money back as undergrad and college. But that doesn't mean I don't think we know things. But I think the things that I'm confident of are common sense. That folks who are serving the public's children and collecting public dollars ought to be held accountable. I'm less certain than I think that I used to be about what the right way to hold them accountable is. I think that educators who are good at their work should be rewarded in various ways, and those who are bad at their work should get better or get fired. But I'm less confident than I used to be about precisely how we measure who's good and bad, and that we have to be more careful about how we do these things. In the end, I think when I got into this stuff, that I thought good intentions and good ideas were what really mattered. And here we are, 3 decades on. I think I've come to decide that good intentions and good ideas actually count for a whole lot less than I used to think. And what really matters, much more than I ever appreciated, is patience, persistence, and wisdom. Dan, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great job. Great job. Today we're enjoying a Friday Forum with Dr. Rick Hess, resident scholar and director of education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute and authors of Letters to a Young Education Reformer. We're about to begin our audience Q&A, and we welcome questions from everyone. Holding the microphones today are content coordinator Bliss Davis and Youth Forum Council Chair Tiolo Orsanya. May we have our first question, please?
This is a bit unfair, but you can take it where you wish. I haven't had a chance to ask someone from the American Enterprise Institute about the Institute, and I'm going to take this chance. Can you tell us something about what the values are that imbue the place where you work, what freedom they give you to take any position you wish, and how it has related specifically to your work in education?
Sure. AEI is a place that's committed to opportunity, to defending opportunity, liberty, freedom for all Americans. Those things obviously mean different things to different people. In my experience, having gone there from the University of Virginia School of Education, in the 16 years I've been there, nobody has once suggested to me what I should write about or shouldn't write about. Nobody has ever given me grief for the positions I've taken. And in my experience, AEI is a place that has offered me a degree of freedom to think and talk about questions in education that I found that to a much where I felt comfortable speaking honestly and straightforwardly in a way I did not in my time at Harvard or University of Virginia.
Hi, my name is Jason Williams, and I'm the founder of an educational nonprofit, Get With The Program. So what do you feel are, I wrote it down. What aspects do you feel are easiest to reform and the hardest, and what role do you see philanthropy and organizations, nonprofits like Get With The Program playing in that reform?
That's a great question. So I think there's easiest and hardest to change, and then there's easiest and hardest when we're actually going to be happy with how things came out. You know, it's easy to change things. The easiest stuff to change, frankly, is what it says on the books. Because you can go out and you can get wins and you can say, kids are now required to do one high school course online. Or you can get a win which says, we are now going to be aligned to this set of expectations. Those are easy wins to track. They're easy wins to report to foundations. They're easy wins to put in an end-of-the-year newsletter to your parents. But I don't think they're actually the wins. I don't think they're bad things, but I think whether that stuff actually leads to anything that matters for kids is almost entirely in all the complicated stuff of how it actually happens. And that's where it gets really hard, because when I talk this way, some of my friends get frustrated. They feel that somehow I am stepping back from the things that we used to fight for in terms of accountability or flexibility. And I don't think I am. I think I'm just suggesting that sometimes when we're trying to get these wins, we presume more than we actually should presume. We don't leave enough room to figure it out. We don't leave enough room to play in the joints. We don't leave enough appreciation that accountability actually has to be closer to the work is executed, that it's hard to do good, sensible, constructive accountability from on high in many of these cases. So I think, you know, the success doesn't mean, hey, we're going to let teachers do things and we're going to cross our fingers and hope it works out for kids. I think success means asking, all right, if we're running a mentoring program, what do we actually expect to see change 9 months from now? What do we want to see change in terms of kids' behaviors? What do we want to see change in terms of how they spend their time? What do we want to see change in terms of their relationships with adults? Let's make sure we're looking at metrics that capture whether or not these ideas are changing the things we want to change, and not just treat reading and math scores as proxies, whether or not they're good and constructive proxies for that thing. I think if you get kids engaged, you get them mentored up, you make them feel connected, I'm willing to bet that if you've got good reading and math tests, those things will move downstream. But I'm not sure those things are going to move in a 9-week or 9-month window, and I want to be careful about that. And I think if we measure wins that way, then we've got to be honest with ourselves and say, hey, we've got this cool mentoring program. It sounds great. It worked great in a pilot somewhere. We've been doing this for 9 months. We haven't seen a lick of difference in these children's lives. We can't keep doing it the same way and expect something's going to change.
Rick, a lot of people date American education reform, or at least the modern version of it, from 1983 and Nation at Risk. Looking at America's schools, first of all, do you see that as a legitimate jumping-off point for comparison? And secondly, how would you compare the state of American schools today and the state of American schools then, and where have we gotten better and where have we gotten worse?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if you sit down in a room of education historians, they'll have these long fights over when does each period begin and end. But I think for a lot of us, Nation at Risk from '83 is a really useful kind of beginning point for the modern conversation. Look, Nation at Risk, people forget sometimes that it was really about the American high school. It was not about K-12. And its solutions were about the American high school. In particular, it was about pushing to ensure that students were taking more courses across the academic subjects for more years. So 4 years of reading, 4 years of math, 4 years of science, ideally. And frankly, we did a lot of those things. And one of the interesting things, Mark Schneider at American Institutes of Research did a piece a few years back where he pointed out, for instance, that if you look at the math courses American students were taking in high school, they were taking many more math courses and many more rigorously titled math courses by the late 1990s than they had been before Nation at Risk. And yet you saw no movement on the National Assessment of Educational Progress for these kids on their math performance. So one of the problems is we can do these reforms, we can comply with them, we can pat ourselves on the back that we're moving kids into classes, but all the evidence is that the teachers were watering down the curriculum because they didn't know how to get these kids moved forward. And I think in a lot of ways, that's kind of the cautionary tale. If you compare American education today to 1983, you know, the international, we weren't doing international assessments in '83, but the American performance on things like PISA and TIMSS has been middling since we started administering that stuff about 15 years ago, and it remains middling today. It's hard to make the case that we've moved in any obvious direction. On National Assessment of Educational Progress, we've seen ups and downs. We're moderately better with 4th and 8th graders today, no better with 17-year-olds. But that's a problem because 17-year-olds have this nasty habit of not caring about tests when you give it to them. So there's been some modest evidence, but it's also the case that we spend, compared to 1983, we spend about 250% more per kid today after inflation than we were spending in the early 80s. So then the question becomes, is modest improvement on NAEP or on graduation rates, you know, good payoff for the money we've invested? So, you know, I mean, it feels to me that it's hard to deny that we've made some incremental gains, that we've made massive gains in terms of mindset and focus and opening up the system to some opportunities to think differently about this work, that we've seen the creation of some phenomenal, say, charter school networks. But as a whole, you know, if American education on the Nation at Risk was issued was a D+, you know, maybe we're a C- today. And that doesn't seem like much of a payoff for all the time and money we've spent.
There's been a lot of focus on, in the reform efforts on evaluating outcome of education, our kids' learning. What is the best way to evaluate education, or what ways really seem to work well and give us really good feedback?
That's a fabulous question. And, you know, that's one of those things where we actually have bitter debates among the experts. Dan Koretz at Harvard just came out with a pretty useful book on this fall called The Testing Charade, in which Dan argues that, you know, we have wound up relying as proxies in this obviously heavily upon reading and math scores. And the problem is we don't always know even when we're moving reading and math scores, are we moving reading and math scores because our children are learning more, and that's capturing a couple of facets of that? Or are they learning more because we're teaching them less other stuff, we're shifting that instruction over to reading and math, and then we are conducting test prep? The answer is, it's honestly really hard to know. We often conduct these debates as if we see movement in test scores or graduation rates as affirmation that we know it's working, but we don't. Washington, D.C., earlier in this week, just reported that 11% of students receiving diplomas this year missed at least half the days of school last year. 11% missed at least 90 days of school. Under D.C. law, they're actually not allowed to graduate if they miss more than 20 days, I believe. But what's happened, and those of you who are, you know, who have any background in social science know Campbell's law kicks in here. When we start focusing on reading scores and math scores and graduation rates, what we do is we create enormous pressure on people in these systems to find ways to move these things. What's the right way to gauge this stuff? You know, the right way, I think, when we think about how those of us think about it for our own kids, it's, do we see them actually evincing a passion for learning? Do we see that they have learned to do things carefully and well? Are they being developed in terms of their unique gifts, as well as reading and math and mastery of science and social and history and social studies. Problem is, when we put it that way, none of us has any idea how to actually assess that well and consistently. Vermont famously tried to do portfolio assessments back in the 90s, and they were the vanguard. And the problem was when two different people would rate the same student work portfolio, the correlation between the two was 0.0. We call that an inter-rater reliability problem. So the answer is that I think we all know how we'd like to judge student performance. The problem is we don't know how to do that consistently or well, especially at scale. So we have fallen back on these measures that we all know are limited, but tell us something. And the problem is, I think, that we have kept trying to ask more of these limited measures that are useful than they can fairly shoulder. And as a result, we have found up turning a pretty boring what should be a pretty boring conversation about, hey, how much should we use reading and math scores and how do we make sure they're useful? What sounds like it should be an incredibly dull faculty meeting into something that has become a screaming match debate for the better part of 15 years.
Hi, are there any states or even specific cities that you feel have been moving closer towards more common sense education as you describe it, and what have they been doing that has been taking them closer to that?
That's a wonderful question. It gives me a chance to use my wonderful dodge, which is, but my friend, Progressive Policy Institute's David Osborne, I see is going to be out in a couple weeks. And David's written a book recently talking about some of the cities that he thinks are doing best. I'll let him talk. What I will say is actually in letters, I talk about how I have learned to duck this question so passionately, because in my earlier, less cautious days, people would ask, Rick, who's a great superintendent? What's a district or a state that's doing it well? And I would answer. And what I came to realize at some point was that I had no earthly idea what the heck I was talking about. There's 14,000 school districts in this country. Some of them share a superintendent. There's about 8,000 superintendents. You know, at any given moment, I maybe knew 20 of these superintendents at the most. I probably most years knew closer to 10 or 15, depending on who'd gotten fired. So I knew a fraction of 1%, but I was shooting off my mouth about who did it well. And when we talked about states and districts, I get out some, but I spent a lot of my time, either teaching at universities or hanging out at a Washington office building. So for me to pretend to speak with any authority, based mostly on word of mouth from friends, what I see in kind of magazine and newspaper pieces about what's actually happening on districts and which ones are. So I just decided several years ago, just that when people ask this incredibly reasonable and thoughtful and constructive question, that I was just going to honestly say, all I can tell you is kind of what I pick up through my echo chambers, and that actually feels probably less helpful than just saying, I honestly don't know.
Hi, thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. I have a question, and I appreciate your humility in explaining that there's so much about reform that we don't understand and aren't familiar with, and there's really no panacea for this. My question for you has to do with what you believe to be the actual purpose of K-12 schooling, which could inform a little bit more of where we would move in the direction of reform.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think it's one we've gotten out of the habit of talking about. I'm a big fan of reading and math scores tell us something. For my money, they probably tell us about, I usually say 35% of what I care about in terms of K-12 learning. What's the goal of K-12 for me? Goal of K-12 is to do two complementary but distinct things. One, it's to help every child develop their gifts. And two, it's to equip every child with the knowledge and skills to be a valued member of our society and of our economy. And those aren't the same thing, but I think they're related things. Now the problem is lots of people, even people who disagree bitterly with me on different stuff, can give answers that sound almost identical. And the real challenge is then, all right, well, what does that mean to translate that into schools? And I can tell, and here's the tricky thing. I can tell you when I'm in a school that feels like it's true to that vision. I can't tell you what kind of state directives or accountability framework will make a school be true to that vision. And somewhere in that gap between those two is, I think, where so much of our, debating takes place. Hi, Courtney.
Yes, so she's watching all the way in Tel Aviv, and she wants to know, what do you think about the current level of spending on public education?
I would say, look, the U.S. spends about $650 billion a year on 50-odd million kids. So we're spending roughly $13,000 a year. For a classroom of 24 kids, that means we're spending somewhere $300,000 to $350,000 per year. You can argue these things internationally. My best judgment is, that's as much as anybody in the world spends per kid. Although you can argue about percentage of GDP and this other stuff. But, and that ranges pretty substantially. It goes from $30,000 or more in a place in New Jersey down to about $6,000 to $7,000 a year out in places like Utah and Nevada. Is that enough money? I don't know.
Eugene Lang, the late philanthropist, famously promised to send the kids from his graduating class at PS, whatever it was in New York, about 30 kids to college, providing they graduated from high school. And then when he realized what commitment he had made, he decided to really help these kids and ended up, I believe, hiring 2 full-time social workers to work with these kids. The result being in a school that almost nobody graduated, something like 27 of the 30 did graduate and did go on to college. How can we possibly measure accountability when it takes that kind of resources in one place, and where my grandchildren go to high school, 95% go to college automatically?
That's a wonderful question. And frankly, I mean, this is part of what we've been wrestling with for, in the Nation at Risk era, is obviously the advantages that children grow up with, family situation, the books they're exposed to, how much vocabulary they hear from age 0 to 6. All of these things have a massive impact on their academic trajectory, likelihood they're going to graduate, and life outcomes. And we want to address that, but in addressing it, we don't want to say, well, wait a minute, some of these problems are things that require us to be measured and thoughtful about what schools and educators can actually do, because we want to make sure that this doesn't happen to any kid. We want every student to succeed. So how do we hold accountable? What we have said is, we have said, no excuses will be made. Every child needs to succeed. If they're not all succeeding, you're not doing your job, which is problematic. So what we can do is we can talk partly about how much students are growing in a year and use that as one element of accountability to try to focus on whether schools and educators are doing their job well, rather than whether they are making miracles happen. But there's a more fundamental point which underlies all this too, which is one of the great victories, and I'll close with this. I think one of the great victories of this era of school reform has been that we have made it clear that it is not okay to say, it's not okay for educators to say, I can't teach those kids. This used to be something you heard all the time back in the 90s. Those kids, can't move them from that neighborhood, from that family. You don't hear that in schools anymore. You don't hear it out loud. You'll hear it quietly. You'll hear it muttered, but you don't hear people say it out loud. Now, here's the thing, though. Along the way, that has been a huge victory. It's been a powerful mind shift. But along the way, we have also said, therefore, schools and educators are accountable for everything that happens, and we're not going to lay any of this on the feet of parents and guardians. And so what's happened is educators have felt scapegoated frequently by the way we talk about it, because they're like, wait a minute, maybe it was a mistake when we used to blame families and let educators off the hook, but now we're blaming educators and we're forgetting that helping a child succeed is always got to be that partnership between parent and teacher, between student and school. And I think the less we talk about this, the more educators have felt alienated and put upon, and rightly so. And I think what we need to strike is a healthier balance about how we think about the part that all parties play. Thank you all so much for the privilege of being with you today.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been enjoying a Friday forum with Dr. Rick Hess, author of Letters to a Young Education Reformer. Today's forum is part of our Education Innovation Series sponsored by the Nordson Corporation. We have Cecilia Render of Nordson with us today. Thank you very much for your support, and thanks to your colleagues as well. It's also part of our Authors in Conversation series, supported in part by the residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. We are grateful to the residents of Cuyahoga County for their support. The community partner for today's event is the Center for Education Leadership at Cleveland State University, and we also welcome guests at tables hosted by the Greater Cleveland Schools Superintendent Association. We thank all of you for being here today. That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you, Dr. Hess. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskind Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.